The National Sector Partners Group for Sport, Recreation and Physical Activity has launched a campaign for all UK political parties to pledge to make the UK the most active nation in Europe. My name is Ricky Boardman, Head of Research and Development at the Sport and Recreation Alliance, and over the next few minutes I'll be unpacking some of the evidence behind this pledge. To date, the UK sport and recreation sector has produced strong evidence of the positive impact of our activities. However, we realised that the scale of impact the sector could potentially but realistically make if activity levels were to rise had never really been modelled or articulated. So, to paint a clearer picture of what it would mean if we were to get the UK more active, we've looked at our nearest European neighbours to see what might be achievable and the dividends the UK could yield if it were to become the most active nation in Europe. Just briefly, before we begin, I want to ask you to keep this image of a Manchester City substitutes bench in mind. Estimated to be worth around 500 million, this is probably the highest valued subs bench in the history of sport. We'll come back to this at the end, but I'd like you to keep in mind this image of enormous value sitting consciously, deliberately unused, but ready to be unleashed. So back to our exam question. Where are we now, and how does this compare to our nearest European neighbours? As you can see from the chart, we are currently joint 11th in Europe, level with Belgium, with 36% of the adult population classed as inactive. This means they do not hit 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week, or 75 minutes of high intensity activity, or a blend of the two that equates to these thresholds. We are narrowly behind Ireland and a little further behind France. Top of the list is Finland, with 83% of adults being classed as active, followed by Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands and Spain. So, in Premier League terms, we're pretty much Crystal Palace. Or in cycling terms, we're just clinging onto the back of the peloton, but well behind the pace set by the race leaders. So what does this mean? Well, as a starting point, it means the UK has a much greater bill to pay in direct healthcare costs of non-communicable diseases attributable to inactivity, the third highest in Europe, in fact, at over £20 per capita. This equates to an average cost of over £72 per inactive adult. Lower down the chart, we find the more active nations with lower per capita costs, and at the bottom, Finland, which pays around a quarter of the UK's costs per capita. We also know there is a direct link between physical activity and well-being. Ranked 9th, the UK actually performs better than our level of activity would predict. But it's still a long way behind the most active nations in Europe, including highest ranked Finland. Finally, we wanted to look at where the UK should be given the level of investment it receives. The most recent direct comparison research from 2018 identifies the UK as allocating the lowest proportion of general government expenditure to sport and recreation at 0.4%. So, going back to our Premier League analogy, we're Crystal Palace in terms of performance, but on Luton's budget. Or, to go back to cycling, we're clinging onto the back of the pack, but on a recreational bike. And this is important because there is a strong correlation between general government expenditure allocation and the percentage of adults hitting their physical activity minimum levels. You can see the average rate of efficiency in converting spend into activity in the upper trend line of the chart. And here, there's some very good news for the UK. In terms of expected physical activity rates, the UK actually overperforms by 67%. In other words, we're currently allocated 0.4%, but return a physical activity rate equivalent to 0.7%. This makes us the second most efficient nation in Europe by this measure, narrowly behind Ireland and well above third-placed Austria. Now, it is fair to say that the UK operates a different tax and spend model than most of the nations featured in this report, so it isn't surprising to see the UK perform well on this measure. However, whatever the investment model used, ultimately the UK still has a much lower physical activity rate than many of our nearest European neighbours. So where do we need to be to become the most active nation in Europe? Well, presuming other nations' activity levels don't change, we need to convert 10.1 of the 19.2 million inactive adults in the UK to draw level with Finland. If we were to meet the new DCMS Get Active strategy target of 2.5 million extra active adults, this would nudge us up 2 places in the league table, ahead of Ireland and Norway. Incidentally, if this target were to be hit with no additional real term spend, it would make the UK by far the most efficient nation in Europe. So what do we get for becoming the most active nation in Europe? Well, before we answer this, it's also important to recognise the value of current activity. Sport England's 2018 report, supported by Sheffield Hallam University, evidences a total of £85 billion worth of value from the current level of activity and volunteering to England alone. So this represents a part of our baseline, but as you're about to see, there is substantial headroom to grow from here. Firstly, by reducing the direct healthcare costs of non-communicable diseases attributable to inactivity, becoming the most active nation in Europe would deliver over £1 billion in savings to the NHS in this area alone. Economically, we would see reduced presenteeism and reduced sickness absence and reduced mortality. Together, these factors would increase productivity to the tune of 3.65 billion in additional GDP per year. Finally, being active produces an increase in life satisfaction at a shade above 0.5 of a point per person on average when measured on a scale of 1 to 10. Using HM Treasury's Green Book on the monetary value of improved well-being, this means the average value of being active is equivalent to £7,000 to each active person per year. If the UK were to become as active as Finland, this would generate the equivalent value of over £70 billion in enhanced well-being and life satisfaction to the UK's adult population. And the benefits don't stop there. Uplifts we haven't modelled here include improved educational attainment and enhanced human capital, reduced crime and antisocial behaviour and improved social capital, increased NHS savings through other benefits, and boost to the economy through increased gross value added and the increased employment required to service new demand. In this presentation, we've evidenced around £75 billion worth of value to the UK, but the total value of being the most active nation in Europe is much, much greater. Finally, I want to return to this image of enormous value waiting to be unleashed. Please ask yourselves, is the UK doing something similar by failing to reap the dividends of being a more active nation? And if it is, why should the UK continue to consciously and deliberately leave so much value sitting on the bench? Thank you for your time, and we hope you'll join our campaign to make the UK the most active nation in Europe.